Okay, so what is flipped? Well, in short, flipped is taking the classroom and interchanging a group space with an individual space. The idea of taking the group space and doing what's most useful in the group space and what's most useful in the individual space and using both to their best ability. Now, the goal of all flipped is, of course, to make more space, more instructional time, more learning. So let's get after it. So if we take a look, flipped classroom is actually a spectrum, beginning with the flipped classroom, the traditional model that you might be familiar with. Then you move to flipped learning. And flipped learning is a deeper style of learning. Flip mastery goes yet another step and really breaks the bonds of what's traditionally considered classroom. And then flip whatever. That could be a lot of things. Gamification is one that's normally mentioned. So let's take a look here. Flipped classroom is most people's entry point. Simply, it is schoolwork at home, homework at school. Although, really, if this is where you're going to stay, if this is really all you're going to do with it, you're losing out on most of the benefit of the flipped classroom. So, with that in mind, let's go back to our discussion of group space versus individual space. Those lectures, especially the lower Bloom stuff, the reactivating of prior knowledge, the introduction of skills, the introduction of vocabulary, those things can be done on an individual space because they're things that the individual is responsible for. What you need to use the group space for is the deeper learning, the cooperative learning, the things that can be used more effectively in group and in collaboration rather than in individual acquisition. So most of the time, a flipped classroom simply reflects time shifting what you already do into different places. And by putting things in different places, you become more efficient. And it really is more efficient, but you can do better than that. So let's move on. Flipped learning, on the other hand, really starts to take, and instead of always doing what we've done and just putting it in different places, what flipped learning does is it takes the whole thing and reorganizes it in such a way that you get different learning experiences, more effective learning experiences, because you take some of those pieces and you move them out of the group space that can be effectively done so. But flip learning really is only happening when you follow the 4 principles of flip. And it has to do with the group learning space, the individual learning space, and making it dynamic, interactive, and student-led. So flexible environment, learning culture, intentional content, and a professional educator. Those are the 4 pillars of FLIP, FLIP. Flexible environment, flexible physical and time environment to encourage interaction and reflection, constant observation and adjustment, flexibility in both learning and demonstration of mastery. The kicker here is you're reorganizing what you do. It's not just the same stuff that you've always done. It's reorganizing what you do to better accomplish what you intend, which is learning. Now, these 4 pillars of flip are actually from the Flip Learning Network. So fellas like John Bergman, Aaron Sams, their book on how to flip your classroom, reaching every student every day, Flip 2.0 with Bretzman and company. Those are some of the places. But take a look at fliplearning.org. Fliplearning.org is where a lot of this information comes from. Learning culture means that meaningful student-centered activities and scaffolding that supports what the videos do. Flip is not about video. Video is really just a basis of support and a way to shift some of the pieces to somewhere else and have them available at any time when the students need it, because the most effective time for them to learn it is when they need it. And the best way to have them need it is to create student-centered, meaningful activities. Finally, you have intentional content. And intentional content, you still have direct instruction because direct instruction is important. And the direct instruction, though, can be accessible to students through the use of technology 24/7, regardless of where they are, on the bus, at home, on the way to school, waiting after school, whatever it is, it's accessible to them. It's also relevant and created by teacher or in some cases by other students. And the key is it's differentiated. Differentiated means each student gets what they need when they need it. And you say, my, that's a tall order. And it is. And it's not always going to happen, but it happens more often in flipped learning because you're putting some of these things available at different times than they would normally have them. Professional educator. One of the biggest downsides that people say to flipped learning is the teacher doesn't do anything. That's wrong. In fact, in flipped learning, you're more busy than ever because you're juggling a whole bunch of plates. Think of the guy spinning the plates or juggling the plates or the chainsaws, as the case may be, as trying to keep everything in the air at once. But the help here is you have a foundation, you have a net of that structured and scaffolded materials. So you're available as a teacher for individual, small group, and even whole class instruction, because there is still a place for whole class instruction. But it's on a different level than it was previously. Constant formative assessment. This is where your data analysis, your ed puzzles, your data gathering, your Google Forms, your Google quizzes, your flu brew, that's where this stuff comes in. And that directs part of your instruction based on where students are and where students are headed. Collaborate and reflect with other educators. That's what you're doing here. All right, working harder to improve your teaching through using the available resources. Now, that's flipped learning. Flipped learning can still follow a fairly traditional linear pattern. It could also go nonlinear. Nonlinear becomes more and more important. But when you really get into it, you start moving toward flipped mastery. And mastery is, of course, where you're taking the principle of mastery learning, but whereas it wasn't really possible to do well previously because of all the data tracking and all of the just raw amounts of numbers and the raw amount of things you had to track, here you marry it with technology and it becomes a whole lot more sustainable and reproducible. Also, this, with key elements of the mastery, students are working at an appropriate pace either by themselves or with others. You have an assessment, but then you have an opportunity for that student to go back and revise and reform and relearn, and then they can take the assessment again. So you can remediate and reassess. And that process moves over and over until you have success, however that's defined. Beyond that, you have gamification. You have some of these other things you say, well, it's not really flipped anymore. No, it's not flipped anymore. In fact, a lot of some of the flip pioneers are moving into other areas because flip allows you to do some of those things that you've always wanted to do, but the mountain of data or the mountain of information became too much. One good example before we end of flip mastery, take a look at Chromebook training. Turn it into a game. And with this, the student can move through, gather the points just like a game board until it all sums up in a final project. So just a couple things to take a look at as you look at flip. So hopefully you've learned a few things. You come ready to go. We'll talk a little